If you listened to the real-life supernatural experiences that I shared last week, you would have noticed two things. First, not all experiences are terrifying. Some can be affirming, or so regular as to have actually become commonplace. Second, they don't need to be full-on light and sound shows to deeply affect someone. We're likely to pay attention to a poltergeist dismantling a room or notice a crisis apparition of a loved one, but we might also overlook the humble, subtle experiences that are part of the fabric of everyday life. They can still be unnerving, but they can also be oddly comforting. But then some of them are also just deeply, deeply weird. So let's hear about some more supernatural experiences from listeners in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I am struggling with my voice again, so let's hope that this episode works all right. We are heading up towards the big day itself. Yes, I do mean Halloween. I'm actually going to be in Dublin for Halloween, so that'll be exciting. But yes, we're going to just crack right on with these supernatural experiences. And the first one in this episode comes from Anna from Yorkshire, whose experience happened in York in 2022. And interestingly, they actually noted several similar reports from their brother and their wife, but for the big one, they were on their own. And this one is just really, really strange. But let's have a listen to what Anna says. And I quote, "I think I saw my own ghost. My mum and dad used to live in a flat overlooking a river in York. It was such a beautiful place to live and we were all really happy there. It became a sanctuary for me when things got tough. The flat was about 15 years old but built on the site of an old hospital, so I didn't think it was that strange that I sometimes sensed a presence in the kitchen. It was usually just a feeling that would come over you when you were in there on your own, like if you turned around you would see someone standing there. My brother and my wife, as well as quite a few friends who came over, reported similar things, or the sense that if you looked into the kitchen from the living room, you would see something, which was exactly what happened to me. When I looked through from the living room and saw, just for a split second, someone stood at the kitchen window looking out over the river. It was so quick, as soon as I'd looked back to check what I'd seen, they'd gone. I was a bit unsettled, but not really scared. The presence had felt quite sad and a bit unsettling, but never violent, which is probably why we never did anything about it. Fast forward to the autumn of 2022. As a family, we had had the worst year imaginable. We were all absolutely at the brink emotionally, and to top it off, my parents had decided to move from York to Leeds to be nearer me. I felt like I was losing my little oasis of peace and my base in a city I loved so much. One evening I was stood at the kitchen window looking at the river, with all this turmoil sloshing around inside me, when I realised someone was standing in the doorway looking at me. I looked back, and just for a second I saw the outline of someone, and then they were gone. This is where it gets difficult to put into words. It was a similar feeling to déjà vu. I knew I was living the same moment again, but from a different place. It could have just been one of those things, and I wouldn't argue with anyone who says it was, but I knew I had just seen myself in that same moment from a few years earlier. After a few months, I finally got the courage to talk to my wife and a friend about it. None of us have any answers, but given everything else that was going on and how much emotional pain I was in at that moment, I feel like if ever there was a moment when I would have imprinted on a place, that would be it. I think now that all the odd stuff that happened there was me, my energy somehow already in that place," end quote. And I did actually message Anna about this and we had a bit of a chat because I've had similar things, not with the same amount of emotional intensity, but just where I've maybe moved around the house in a particular way and heard like noises in other parts of the house, like particular patterns of footsteps and things. And then later on that day, I've realised I'm then doing whatever it was to cause the pattern of footsteps that I heard earlier. It's really weird. And I think this, quite honestly, takes us into the realm of time slips. And I think if you've listened to the podcast for a while, obviously you'll know there is an episode about time slips. I absolutely love them. I find them fascinating. And I think they are one of those things that is just so difficult for people to really debunk because of the nature of them. But I think that in this case, it's not so much allowing like a glimpse of the other world. It's kind of another perspective on our own. It's very, very strange. And it also just kind of speaks to the fact that time doesn't appear to be linear. And obviously there are other cultures which have known this for thousands of years, and the West has only just caught up with them. But I do think that this is very, very strange as a story, and I can see why it would have such a deep emotional impact on someone. But I do just go, oh wow, yeah, it's a time slip. And I love time slip stories. So I was really, really sad that Anna had this horrible time, but that this experience kind of came out of it is just really, really interesting. So yeah, if anyone else has ever experienced a time slip, please do let me know, because like I say, I do find them genuinely interesting. And I think it's quite interesting that it's less that it's a ghost, but it's like you yourself are haunting the place just because of the way that time's kind of echoing back on itself, if that makes any kind of sense. But yeah, I thought that was a really good way to start the episode, because that is quite an experience. Next up is Deborah, who's from Pittsburgh, but the experience happened in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1973. So Deborah says, and I quote, "As a student with a summer job far from home, I was between places to stay, and friends put me up temporarily on the sofa in their late 19th century house. The whole family went out the first night I was to stay there, and the older son stayed behind to show me around the house. After he left for a party, I was watching TV and playing solitaire in the front parlour. I heard an internal door slam, it was starting to storm, and I went round making sure the windows and doors were all shut. This happened at least twice more. Everything was firmly shut. Then I heard at least 2 pairs of feet walking around upstairs and men's voices talking. I sat with my back against the door holding it closed until the family came home around 1 a.m. It was explained to me that the house had at least 3 different manifestations, and they considered they had protective spirits. One would be heard coming down the front stairs, stopping at the bottom. There was the walking around talking set, and sometimes they would smell Bayberry candles. She thought they didn't realise I was supposed to be there and were trying to drive me out. I was told many more stories while I stayed there most of the summer, but personally never heard anything else." End quote. And I love this story because, again, it's the idea of the family sharing this space with other spirits, but just kind of letting them hang out there. Not this sense of, oh, this is my house, get out kind of thing that you often see in like haunted house films or whatever, but that ability to share space with other beings. I do have a bonus episode on Patreon about land spirits and house spirits in particular, and house spirits specifically appear in quite a lot of folklore, and they are different from ghosts, but I do think that ghosts themselves can provide a protective element if they choose to. So they could obviously be protective of the house or indeed those within it. I also like the fact that because you hear the men's voices talking, a skeptic might go, oh, hang on, but that just sounds like the doors are making a noise because a storm's coming on. Storms aren't really famous for also talking. So I did think that was like, oh God, that would be really freaky. So yeah, I did think that was quite an interesting one. And the fact that Deborah never heard anything again, it's almost like the spirits are like, oh yeah, no, cool, you're supposed to be here. Great. And then they just sort of move on. So I did think that was a really interesting experience. Obviously, it would be awful for Deborah while it happened, but more just for the family being, yeah, no, it's cool, we know who they are. And again, it's that mundanity of it that I really like about experiences. Now, our next experience is from Steve, who's from London, but his experience happened in both France and London in around 1978 and then around 2000, respectively. Now, Steve was with his brother for the first one and alone for the second, and he says, and I quote, "I don't know whether this counts. I don't believe in the supernatural as such. Everything that exists is natural. There are things we understand and things we haven't explained. Sometimes that's because of insufficient data, or it's a phenomena that is currently beyond our understanding. Which isn't to say that I don't enjoy all manner of spooky goings-on and their telling. So I have a couple. Here's one that happened around 1978. I lived in southwest France in the Dordogne for most of my teenage years. Our local town, and I've no idea how to pronounce it, so I am very, very sorry, but Ribérac, population 6,000, had the largest market for miles around and was a pretty exciting place to visit. So this particular Friday, it was sunny and bright. Pete and I were cutting up from the main market square past l'Hôtel de France, the town's only half-decent hotel, to get to the post office. It's rather a narrow road that, whilst 2-lane, doesn't really allow for more than one car at a time. On this occasion, it was mostly blocked by a delivery lorry. The lorry was facing us, so we couldn't see what they were unloading, but they had one of those electric tailgate lifts that we could hear whirring away. Pete went to walk up the pavement between the lorry and the side wall of a shop. For some reason, I put my hand on his arm and stopped him. At that very instant, some large domestic appliance, a washing machine perhaps, fell from the tailgate right where Pete would have been standing. We both just looked at each other and went the other way around the lorry. The second one is from around 2000. We live in a modern house in southeast London built in 1997 on the site of a former hospital which before that was a workhouse. Our house stands where the workhouse morgue would have been. I've checked and overlaid old maps. We find weird bits of pottery and old bottles in our garden, but no bones to date. I had a heavy cold and was snoring a lot, so I slept in the spare room at the back of the house that night. I was awoken by a strange noise. It was still dark, but I could tell there was someone in the room, standing by the bottom of the bed. It was an old woman, I think, and there was the sound of white noise when she opened her mouth. I couldn't move my limbs, but I found that by shifting my weight from side to side, the rocking freed up my arms, and then I could move again. When I looked, there was no one there, so I went back to sleep. The same thing happened again, old woman, weird noise, paralysis. And then a third time. I was getting bored by now and decided that should it happen again, I'd go to sleep on the sofa. The next time I woke up, it was morning, and it has never happened to me since, even when I spent 2 weeks in the room isolating with COVID. I should note some things here. I wasn't at any point scared. I already knew what sleep paralysis was and quite enjoyed the first occasion. I also realised later that when I saw the old woman, my eyes weren't actually open, end quote. I love the fact that Steve's like, I wasn't actually scared. And it's like, I love that about the experience, that it's just accepted as something bizarre is happening. What is it? And that air of curiosity, I think. And also like, oh, come on, I'm getting sick of this. Those two things, I think, really speak a lot to Steve's approach to these things, which I find quite interesting. But also just the idea that, again, supernatural experiences in any shape or form don't necessarily need to actually be frightening. The first one in France, I think everybody, when you think about it, will be able to think of a moment where you're like, oh, I would have been standing there, or if I had been just 5 minutes later, that would have happened. A lot of people will have these like near misses. And usually when that happen, it'll be that kind of thing where something else has held you up. And it might feel a little bit like coincidence, but a helpful coincidence. But for Steve to suddenly have the urge to sort of put his arm out and stop his friend, yes, you could argue on some unconscious level, he may have heard the noise of something starting to fall. And obviously the unconscious can work faster than the conscious mind. So that unconsciously he's put his arm out and stopped his friend. But you could also argue that there's just been some other force at play. It's difficult to tell. It's so long ago. There's no way really to check. But it's quite an interesting one that he's actually been the one involved in stopping the person from being where they would then encounter harm. As for the second one, the idea of the old woman, the very fact that Steve knows that his house is built on the old workhouse morgue, I'm like, that level of investigation I already applaud on so many levels. And I think it is a really interesting thing to do, to work out where your house is, if that makes sense. Like, I know where my house is, it used to be farmers' fields, but before that there are actually mine workings underground, and they would actually be under the entire housing estate, but the housing estate has been built in such a way that obviously if a mine tunnel collapsed now, it doesn't lead to a sinkhole. And obviously where I am, like a stone's throw away, they did actually find remains of like Bronze Age villages and stuff. So clearly there's been occupation on the site that I'm on for like thousands and thousands of years. But my house specifically, farmers' fields. So, you know, no Roman villas in the garden for me. No inviting time team round to dig up the garden or anything like that. But I love the fact that Steve's gone looking and gone, oh, this is where the workhouse morgue would have been. And I just think that's brilliant. More people should do that level of investigation, just because it's interesting more than anything. But I think the idea that the woman opening her mouth and then producing white noise is an interesting one, because it's almost like she's trying to communicate, but just on a different frequency that we just don't understand. So that also caught my attention for various reasons. The very fact that she only really appeared on that one occasion and not other times that you were in the room, does she feel that she got her point across? The fact that Steve's eyes were closed at the time does also still make me think, is this some kind of sleep-based thing? Because obviously sleep paralysis is really, really horrible if anyone's ever had it before. I have, but I've always known that I was asleep at the time, and I've been fighting to wake up, and I've woken up and been caught in that sort of point between the two states. But anything I've been dreaming, I've known I was dreaming and I've known I was asleep. So I've never had one of the waking visions which sound genuinely terrifying. So I did wonder if there was an element of that going on there, but at the same time, the very fact that you were able to move enough to break the paralysis would possibly indicate not. So it'd be interesting to know who the old woman was, if she was somebody that had been taken to the morgue, or if maybe she worked there. I don't know, but I did think that was quite an interesting one, that it never happened again. So she clearly got whatever it was off her chest in that particular instance. So that was an interesting one. So the next experience comes from Paul from New York, whose two experiences happened near Syracuse, New York State in 2005. Now, Paul was alone for one of them and with fraternity brothers for the other, but I shall let him tell you the rest. So Paul says, and I quote, "I was living in a Victorian mansion near Syracuse University that had been converted to student apartments. There were two specific encounters I had in this house. My roommate had another, but that's his story to share. One happened when I was coming home. I unlocked the door, but when I turned the knob, the door was still locked. I must not have fully unlocked the door. So I go to put my key back in the lock, but as I'm doing this, before the key even touches anything, the door creaks open. Very strange. The other was with my fraternity brothers. I had the bright idea of doing an initiation ritual in the big basement. It was largely empty, with just the washers and dryers for laundry. Lots of old rooms down there, though, canning shelves, empty coal bins, and the like. I got the distinct impression of being unwelcome in the space, but I shrugged it off. Creepy basements are creepy after all. We started lighting some candles and doing a practice run when I started smelling gas. That was my excuse to GTFO. As soon as we started packing things up, the smell went away. Someone knows how to get what they want." End quote. And I did like that whole, creepy basements are creepy. I mean, we don't really have basements as such in the UK, like depending on where you are. So just the idea of basements in general, I always find really odd. But I did think the idea of smelling gas while lighting candles was a really interesting way to get you to leave the basement, particularly with the idea that the smell going off again when you started packing up. Because if it had persisted, you could go, well, you possibly had a gas leak. But for it to go away like, oh, that's all right, well, they're going now, we can stop. I thought that almost does imply some sense of intelligence behind what was happening. So for whatever reason, they clearly didn't want you in the basement. As for the door, there is a little bit of that where you think, could that have had a practical, mundane explanation? Or was it just the house playing tricks on you? Who knows? And I think this is the thing sometimes. It's not necessarily that there's a ghost in the house. It's that the house itself is its own spirit, and it can obviously sometimes be like, nah man, I'm not really bothered about you, and so on. So again, something worth bearing in mind. Now, our final experience for this episode comes from Paul from New York. I don't know if it's the same Paul from New York, or if I just happen to have two listeners both called Paul from New York, whose experiences always happen in or near Syracuse. I don't know, but this one also happened just outside Syracuse, New York State in October 2021. And this, Paul says, and I quote, "My fiancé and I were in Syracuse for a friend's wedding, staying at a rental on the outskirts of town. The house was a converted Italianate mansion, with the bottom floor being one rental unit. Our bed was in the former parlour and it was too small. We were promised a queen bed, but it was only a full, which makes a bit difference when you're two big guys. This becomes relevant very soon. So we go to sleep on the bed, but I'm woken in the middle of the night by a figure standing next to me, letting me know I was about to fall off the bed. It wasn't frightening at all. Honestly, I felt his concern, and I was right about to fall off. So I scoot over and get my cuddle on with my fiancé. As I'm falling asleep, he lets me know his name was Lee. It wasn't like I heard his voice, more like I could sense what he wanted me to know. In the morning, I realised that the bedside table had some very sharp corners and would have hit me right in the back of the neck should I have fallen. Maybe Lee didn't want another ghost for company. When I told my fiancé about this, he laughed and said Lee certainly has a sense of humour. The ghost named Lee? Ghost Lee? Ghostly? I rolled my eyes. It was just his name. In retrospect, I should go back and look up some of the records for that house to see if someone named Lee ever lived there. It seemed really important for Lee to tell me his name and also not have me die there. End quote. Now, that one was really interesting because, again, it's one of those experiences that you might otherwise overlook and go, yeah, that was weird, and then never think about it again. And there is also an element that you think, was there actually a figure saying you're about to fall off, or on some unconscious level, did you wake yourself up? And to be honest with you, either way, that's still kind of cool, because on one hand you've got, was it actually a ghost waking you up being like, hey, you're about to fall out of bed, you might want to sort that out. But on the other hand, your unconscious has figured all of this out and then projects a figure to tell you the same information. Either way, whether it's supernatural or not, it's, as I say, I just find these kind of experiences really interesting, regardless of what causes them. It would be cool to know if anyone called Lee had ever lived there, because they would need to have some kind of connection with the house, but it could also just be somewhere that they'd spent a lot of time. It could also be someone that you'd taken with you as well. So it may be some family member or someone that you're just not aware of who for some reason has taken it upon themselves to keep an eye on you. So again, something else to think about there. But as I say, I think all of this is quite creepy stuff, but I think that the stories that I've picked for this particular episode, there is that sort of through line of weirdness and just general bizarreness, but then there's also like a bizarre kind of protective element to it. So, for example, the first Paul from New York, perhaps the spirit's trying to get them out of the basement. They may have been trying to protect them from being in a creepy basement. You know what I mean? You don't know what else is down in the basement. That they're like, actually, no, you don't really want to be down here. The idea of the protective spirits in Deborah's case as well, I thought were really interesting. And you do kind of go, yeah, they obviously must have accepted her for them to not appear again. And so, in fact, she wasn't aware of them going into the house. It's not like you can then say, oh, well, you know, this is something that happens and therefore I've imagined it. If you didn't know that that kind of thing went on, then why would you know that? So I do think, as I say, that these ones, and also even Steve's one, this idea of the protecting his friend and this strange woman appearing in the bedroom and so on, I do think that it goes to show that not all of these experiences need necessarily be negative. And then if we go back to Anna's at the beginning with the time slip, that one, I think, while yes, there's a lot of sadness associated with it, the glimpse of how the universe might work within that with the slippages of time, I think is also still really interesting and something worth bearing in mind. Now, I did tell you that I would add some of my own supernatural experiences to these episodes. And last week I told you about the experience that I had on the ghost hunt that I did at Jedburgh Castle and Jail on Saturday with Rob Kirkup from How Haunted podcast. Now, since then, I have actually listened to the audio recordings that I made on the night, and it's really frustrating because there was one of them where they were trying to find out the name of the spirit of a little girl, and I had tried to do an EVP, but unfortunately there's way too much background noise from people just moving around, and there's no way to tell if the recorder picked up anything supernatural. And on the back of that, yes, EVPs can be problematic in the sense that your ear is trained to pick up voices, like, because humans are a species that communicate with each other, so your ear will sometimes hear what it thinks is there rather than what's actually there. But when I listen back to the recordings, it's literally just people moving around. It's that sound of fabric on fabric, it's footsteps. And this is the problem when you do public ghost hunts. Sometimes people don't realise that when you do EVPs, you need to actually be silent, and you also need to leave space in between questions. So the team leader would be like, did you die here? How did you die here? And like, there's no time in between for somebody to actually answer the question. So you need to give a space for a response as well. So it's a bit annoying that I didn't actually pick anything up, but these things happen. So I did want to tell you instead about a couple of bizarre experiences that I had at work. Now, obviously, podcasting is not my full-time job, which is a shame because I really wish that it was. But instead, I do actually teach at a college. And at the time when all of this happened, I used to teach night classes in the Adobe software. So Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, that kind of thing. Which explains why I was at work at night. Yes, I did used to have to work from like 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. some nights. It was thrilling. But anyway, on this occasion, I was sitting using the teaching Mac at the front of one of the classrooms to prepare for my night class later that evening. Now, the studios all have motion sensors on the light so that they turn off when there's no one moving in the room, obviously to save power. It's fairly standard. They've got them right across the campus. It's no big thing. But one sensor covers the front half of the room because they're quite large rooms, and the other covers the back. So you can be moving around at the front half of the room and the back half switches off. Now, you do have to jump up and down and kind of do jumping jacks to actually get the lights to come back on if you are still for long enough that the lights turn off, because they're not particularly sensitive sensors. So they're not the kind of thing where they'll just flick on and flick off. Like, they will flick off if there's no activity, but it takes a fair bit to get them to come back on again. So that becomes relevant in a minute. Because I was sitting working at the Mac, like I say, when the lights at the back of the studio went off. Now, I left them off because I didn't need them. I just really needed the ones at the front. But then a few minutes later, for no apparent reason, the lights came on again at the back. Now, I hadn't moved and the sensor didn't pick up the front half of the studio where I was anyway. The classroom was also on the first floor, so it wouldn't have detected anyone walking past the window. And the sensor also faced into the room as well. It didn't pick up the service road outside, but again, that would have been like a floor below, so it couldn't really have been set off by anything outside. It would have to have been something in the studio. Now, I'd sometimes felt uneasy at the back of that room anyway. Occasionally you would almost feel like someone was standing staring at you from the corner, but then I wasn't sure if that was just a psychological itch, as it were, because of the fact that also you were sitting with your back to the windows. But I'd always felt a little bit weird in that part of the studio anyway. But it was certainly weird to have the lights come on by themselves when nobody had moved to bring them on. That was definitely weird. But that wasn't the only thing, because I was frequently the only person in the building with my students. So there'd be me and maybe 20 people downstairs in the basement in one of the computer rooms. And the night classes always went from 6 till 9 p.m. with a break in the middle. But every night between about 7 and 7:30 p.m, we would hear someone walking around on the ground floor in high heels above us. And I was trying to work out where that would be in the building. And I think that would have been within the photography department. Now, none of the tutors wore high heels. All of my students were in the computer room with me. There were no other night classes going on. And only security would be potentially upstairs, but they don't tend to walk around in high heels anyway. And I've never found out who or what was making those footsteps, but it got to the point where it became like a running joke between me and my students. But yeah, so that was really bizarre as well. So was that spirits at work again? Who knows? I did try to work out what was on the site originally, but even bearing that in mind, there's no explanation for high heels walking around between 7 and 7:30. And also I taught different night classes on different days of the week, and it did kind of happen every time. So it made me wonder, is that some kind of residual thing? Again, is it a time slip and we're actually hearing from activity from earlier in the day or something? I don't know. It's certainly weird, and I've never been able to explain the footsteps, but that was why I thought I would share them with you now. Obviously, for next week, it is our final supernatural encounters. Obviously, yes, we are going into November, but after that episode, we will then be having a look at the folklore of mammals, which was a listener request, so that's good as well. And yeah, we'll have our final installment of supernatural encounters, like I say, next week, and then we'll be moving on. So I hope you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.